Hi, everybody. This session, we will be looking at prisons and resistance. In this chapter, Davis starts to move on from her review of history into what has been done to try to challenge the prison system. We also see a little bit of a rehash of material. So let's talk about the rise of the modern prison. We did talk about this in terms of slavery, but there were a few points that were missed. So the modern prison is an invention of the Enlightenment. That is important to point out. If you haven't taken a history class recently, reminder, the Enlightenment was basically the dawn of the modern era. This is when we developed scientific thought. This is when the Western world developed rational thinking. Um, it's when we came out of, it's when we had the Renaissance. It's when we came out of the Dark Ages or the medieval times or whatever you want to call them. It's also when we developed democracy worldwide, and it really spread in a international kind of way. We did have small pockets of democracy prior to the Enlightenment, but then we saw rise of modern democracies, modern republics. Um, and this is when we saw the American Revolution. This is when we saw the French Revolution and uh, the Bolivar Revolution in Latin America. All these. And this is when we developed the concept of individual rights and liberties. Prior to the modern era, it wasn't thought that you, as an existing human being, had any rights to anything. And that concept of individual rights was actually very important to the rise of the prison industrial complex, strangely enough. The rise of the prison system also occurred at the same time as the rise of capitalism. These are not cause and effect. It's not a vast conspiracy that somehow the rise of modern business happened at the same time as the prison system. But these are things that happen at the same time. And we see these two social institutions interacting in a way that most of us probably see as troubling. As was stated in previous lectures, in the mid 1800s, those who built the current system were trying to make a better system for punishing criminals. So prior to the Enlightenment, prior to the institution of Enlightenment type ideas, pain was seen as the way to punish criminals, right? Because there was no concept of individual rights. So if there is no such thing as individual rights, then you can't imprison people. You can't punish people by taking away their rights. The only way you can punish human beings is to hurt them physically. And reformers wanted to stop that. As was stated in previous lectures, the techniques involved in punishing criminals were things like lynching, tarring and feathering, pillories, and whipping. Anything to harm the person physically. And prisons were seen as being more humane. Um, so if you have rights, as was determined by the Enlightenment, you could be punished if someone took away those rights. And the premise of locking someone up, of not allowing them to go about their life and pursue that liberty and pursuit of happiness, and using that as a way to punish people, that is a modern conception of punishment and what led to the rise of modern prisons. It should be noted, most modern prisons are what could be called panopticons. Um, so a panopticon is a prison that is situated so that guards can see prisoners, but prisoners cannot see guards. And if a prisoner can't see the guard, but the prisoner knows that the guard can see the prisoner, they have to make the assumption the prisoner has to make the assumption that they are always being watched. Therefore, they always have to basically behave themselves. And this idea was originally made possible by architecture. We see a small model of that in the lower right-hand corner. Basically, the whole prison would be in one massive cylinder, and then there would be a guard tower that was lit up in the middle, that the guards were hidden by shadows, but the guards could look into every single prison cell without the prisoners actually knowing that they were being watched. Um, and that was the original conception of it. It was made by architecture and it had to be laid out in this very specific way. Modern panopticons, which is what almost all modern prisons are, though, use it through video cameras. It's pretty simple. You just have a small video camera looking at every single cell, and the guards could hypothetically be watching prisoners at any given time. And that's really a cornerstone of what makes a modern prison a modern prison. Now, let's talk more about opponents of the prison system, which was the main topic of this chapter. When prisons were first formed, they were seen as a less horrible way of dealing with criminals. Those advocating for prisons did not think that it was the best system, only that it was a system that worked at the moment. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about modern prisons, is they were seen as being, well, we have to stop beating people in the streets. We have to stop lynching people. What are we going to do? Well, let's just lock them up and store them like a warehouse for now and think of something later. Well, they never thought of anything later. So now we're stuck with prisons as a system that we all think we just have to have. When prisons were first put into place, they didn't think that. It was a temporary solution. And we can see a lot of these thoughts in the historic record. Charles Dickens, he's the writer of Moby Dick, and the writer, wait, I don't think Charles Dickens didn't write Moby Dick. Sorry about that. Um, the writer of A Christmas Carol, for example, uh, now I'm going to have to look up if Dickens wrote Moby Dick. Anyway, but Dickens, the author, he was known as being a staunch opponent of prisons. And there are many other such staunch opponents of prisons. Actually, within The Christmas Carol, when Scrooge is saying, "Are there no poorhouses? Are there no workhouses to put these people?" He's talking about prisons that were set up to hold people that were debtors, right? Debtors' prisons. And in that, that's just one example of Dickens and other people at the time being very anti-prison, but of course they would also be anti-corporal punishment. So in the current system as it exists, rights are not respected, right? Prisons exist basically to take away individuals' rights and individual freedoms. And there is very little concern for the individual. There is no sense that men and women incarcerated in supermaxes deserve anything approaching comfort, right? And that is different than other prison systems. Prisons in Europe, prisons in Scandinavia, their prisons are much more comfortable than our prisons are. And they have actually lower recidivism rates. They have lower rates of recommitting crimes than we do in the United States. Sexual assault, as we are all aware of, is common in prisons. The rates are probably not as high as we perceive them as being, but it's a reality. Sexual assault is a reality. And there is no appreciable rehabilitation within the American prison system. We don't really have education programs anymore, which really was the last bastion of the hope that prisons could be used to fix people. That concept of prisons being used to fix people is why we institute prisons in the first place in the 1800s, right? Um, yeah, so, and as a matter of fact, all of these terrible things that I just listed, we expect these of people in prison, and they expect the prison system to do this to people. We expect that that's just part of the punishment of prisons. The fact of the matter is, prisons were set up in the mid 1800s as a way of basically making the individual take a protracted time out, right? Okay, you sit over here in this corner for 5 years and think about what you did. We did not originally set up the system to physically punish people, right? We were trying to get away from physical punishment. And that's, as I've read over this book, really um, a big part of what is causing me to really kind of start siding with Davis in terms of prison abolition. Um, and these are really interesting topics that I hope we get to talking about this week. And I look forward to our conversations. Okay, talk to you later.